Okay, hi, it's Rabbi Travis here. Um, as you can see from the background, I am not home. I am up at my place in the mountains. It's a dreary, rainy afternoon. I'm going to see if I can record this. Minimum amount of rain in the background. I'm trying something new today. I'm using Zoom to make a recording because Zoom allows me to share my screen with you and to play videos right in this recording. I think that's how it that's in theory how it's going to work. So we're going to try it. Maybe it'll be a little better than me picking up my laptop as I did in the last one and setting in front of my desktop. After doing that lesson for you, making comparisons between President Trump and President Reagan, it got me thinking about Jimmy Carter for a number of reasons. Jimmy Carter is largely regarded as an ineffectual president. He served one term. We're going to talk about the crises that he didn't manage well, which resulted in him only serving one term. And in that regard, there may or may not be similarities with Trump. In all due respect to those of you listening, I try not to make political statements too often, but it's quite obvious that President Trump has badly managed this coronavirus outbreak, this pandemic, and we'll see if it results in him being a one-term president like Jimmy Carter. I think, especially if Trump is a one-term president, he will be viewed as ineffectual, I would dare say even more so, than Carter. So there may be some comparisons there. On the flip side, for all his shortcomings as president, Jimmy Carter, in my view, has really set the bar for what an ex-president can do and achieve. He is a truly great man, kind man. He's done much good in his years out of office, working with Habitat for Humanity, establishing the Carter Center, which is overseeing elections in a variety of countries. And notwithstanding his very virulent anti-Israel stands in his later years, he's been a respected figure as an ex-president. As an aside, I'll mention to you, several years ago, I was in a lecture by Ken Stein. Ken Stein was one of Carter's top advisors. Stein broke with Carter. Stein teaches at Emory University. He runs the Institute for the Study of Modern Israel. And Stein broke with Carter when Carter published that book calling Israel an apartheid state. But Stein says during the years in the White House, Carter was very empathetic towards Israel and the Jewish people. I'll share with you two anecdotes that Ken Stein shared with the group. He was once flying with Carter, I don't remember where, to one of the Middle Eastern countries. It was a Friday night. Stein is openly Jewish but not observant. And when they brought him his meal on Air Force One, there was a mini challah and some wine. And Carter said, "This, I understand this is what your people do on Friday nights." There was another time, there was a retreat on one of the Georgia islands. It's not Jekyll Island, I forget which one. It was an annual affair for top thinkers, and Stein was there. And he was walking towards the beach, and he could see they had barbecue set up and mounds of shrimp. And Stein said he was thinking to himself, "Oh, what am I going to eat?" And Carter came up to him and put his arm around his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, I've got food for you to eat." So Stein was really confused and shocked by Carter's strong turn against Israel. Who knows what goes on? You know, is it a reflection of Carter's great disappointment that the Camp David Accords that he shepherded through, we'll talk about that, which led to the Oslo agreements, imploded in 2000, have only gotten worse since then. Who knows? But I think it's an interesting contrast because Carter, no matter what you think of him as a politician, is a wonderful human being. In his 90s, recovering from brain cancer, he still teaches Sunday school. And if you compare him to the current occupant of the White House, enough said. The other thing that strikes me about Carter before we start talking about his administration, Carter was arguably one of the brightest men ever to be president. He was a commander of a nuclear sub in the Navy, and by all accounts, he was very, very, very bright. And that may have contributed to his downfall in the sense that, when you think you're the smartest person in the room, and you arguably are the smartest person in the room, you don't always listen to people's advice. And so that may have been part of Carter's weakness as a president. We compare that to the current president, who believes he's the smartest person in the room, and he often tells people that he's the smartest person in the room, but he's not. And so he doesn't listen to experts and advisors, and he makes decisions, as he tells us, based on his gut and based on his wonderful brain. And they don't always work out so well. So let's talk about Carter a little bit. What I want to do is spend some time talking about the two major crises which led to the implosion of his presidency and ultimately led to his being routed in 1980 by Ronald Reagan. And then in fairness, I want to talk about the legacies of the Carter administration, because he did do some good things. And we'll leave it to you to weigh where you think he is. Again, he's a one-term president, seen as largely as an ineffective president. And let's see how that works. I'm going to toggle between this screen and some of my notes. So while I'm talking, for the most part, you'll still see me, even though I'm not going to always see you. So I want to start with the crises that led to the downfall of his presidency. So the first one involved the oil shock of 1978, 1979. Maybe you remember it, maybe you don't. But it was the second great oil shock of the 1970s. It was also associated with events in the Middle East. The first oil crisis of the 70s was driven by the Yom Kippur War. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Producing Countries, which at that time was largely Arab countries, had an oil boycott of the United States in response to the U.S. support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices skyrocketed overnight. By our standards, they were still ridiculously low. But I remember very well, because my first job out of college, I graduated in 1980, was for the Department of Energy, and there were some very complicated oil regulations in place. I worked for an office that managed it, but to give you a perspective, overnight in 73, if you were processing domestically produced oil, you were paying $6 a barrel. If you were reliant upon imported oil, you were paying $35 a barrel. You couldn't compete. Fast forward to 78, 79. The Iranian Revolution began in early 78 and ended a year later when the Shah, his government collapsed, and the Ayatollah Khomeini took control as the Grand Ayatollah of the Islamic Republic. In conjunction with that revolution, Iranian oil output declined by 4.8 million barrels a day, which was at that time 7% of world production. The supply disruption may not have been the most important factor in pushing oil prices higher. The Iranian disruption really prompted a fear of further disruptions, and it spurred widespread speculative hoarding. Oil prices began to rise rapidly by mid-79, more than doubling between April 79 and April 1980. Excuse me. According to one estimate, the surging oil demand, coming both from a booming global economy at the time and a sharp increase in precautionary demand, was responsible for much of the increase of costs during the crisis. Now, in early 78, the Federal Reserve had maintained a highly accommodative stance of monetary policy, hoping to combat rising unemployment. Ultimately, though, the policy showed little success in stifling the deterioration of unemployment rate, and it probably fostered an environment that allowed the rising energy prices to impact the general rate of inflation. Consumer inflation, which had already begun to accelerate in the United States, continued to rise. It was below 5% in early 76. It was nearly 7% by March of 1979. By that time, members of the Federal Open Market Committee thought that the inflation would continue to rise and was growing. Records from meetings in 78 indicated there was considerable concern about the rate of inflation and that it might accelerate significantly. But despite this, they kept monetary policy as it was. You should know that the Fed is an independent entity. Its directors are supposed to be apolitical. In the current administration, President Trump has tried to put political supporters in place to run the Fed and have the Fed do what he wants as opposed to what the economists think is best, but that's a discussion perhaps for another day. So back to 79, the committee responsible for monetary policy was really hesitant to raise interest rates too aggressively because they thought it would stifle economic growth. I mean, there's a balancing act when you manage interest rates between trying to keep inflation low and encourage economic growth. The Fed raised federal funds from 6.9% in April 78 to 10% by the end of the year. To put into context, the federal rate right now is 0.25%, almost zero. The increase was a clear move to try and curb inflation, but it didn't work. Even though the Fed raised the rate, it wasn't enough. By the end of 1979, inflation was running at 9%. Carter appointed Paul Volcker as the federal chair in August 79, and it was seen as an endorsement of a more aggressive monetary policy to try and break the inflation stranglehold on the U.S. economy. I mention all this. Let me give you some more figures. When Volcker was guiding the Fed, when he took office in late 79, inflation was at 11%. It peaked at 19% in 1981. So you have an economy that's hemorrhaging in a sense. Very, very high inflation, exploding oil prices. It pushed the economy into what was then the most severe recession since the Great Depression. And so this made Carter very unpopular because the president is always blamed for the economy. The reality is the economy sort of runs on its own. Presidents think they can push it and prod it, but they really can't. I mean, if you look historically, they generally don't have such a big impact. I don't want to say it doesn't matter who's in the White House, but from an economic perspective, it often doesn't matter who's in the White House. Nonetheless, the president is blamed when the economy is going bad, as was the case with Carter in 79 and 80 in the run-up to the election. And as until the coronavirus, the converse was true. Trump was taking credit for a booming economy, even though much of the growth had been taking place before he took office, and the continued growth was part of a long-term trend. But again, the president is either blamed or credited with the strong or weak economy. So crisis number one that Carter did not handle so well was the economic sphere. Now, compounding things, in response to these economic issues going on, Carter had a national address to the country, trying to reassure them. In hindsight, and I'm gonna play for you a portion of this speech. Now, let me make a couple points about the speech. The speech has been coined the crisis of confidence speech. It was delivered to the country in July of 1979. Jimmy Carter never uttered those words. This was supposed to be an uplifting sort of speech, a pep talk to the country. And if you look at the media in the days immediately following the speech was received very positively. So why did it morph into this crisis of confidence speech? Because 3 days after the speech, Carter fired most of his cabinet. That was seen as a sign of panic, bad move. In other words, had Carter kept his cabinet in place, the pep talk might have worked. By firing the cabinet, he was making the country think there was a crisis going on, a crisis of confidence, hence the name of the speech. It's analogous, if you will, to President Trump refusing right now to wear a mask. His view is that if he's seen wearing a mask, the public will think the coronavirus is really bad, and it's still really bad, and it really is still bad. I just read today, as an aside, in the past 2 days, yesterday, one of the president's valets tested positive for the coronavirus. Today, they released that Vice President Pence's press secretary tested positive. She is the wife of Stephen Miller, one of the top aides to the president. So senior officials in the White House, including the president and vice president, have now been exposed to the coronavirus. Now, apparently, they say that president, vice president, and senior staff members are now being tested every day. We will see. So let me, I'm going to see if I can share my screen with you so you can see this video as it's playing. When it's done, I will come back over. I'm going to put it in full screen mode, and I'm going to play the video. I'm going to make sure the volume is up so you can hear it. Here we go. So that was just an excerpt of the speech. I wanted you to hear Carter's words himself. As I said, the speech itself was generally well received, but it was actions post-speech that really had people questioning the direction of government, the direction of Carter's administration. So this is the first great crisis, something arguably beyond Carter's control, though in hindsight, one could argue that by accepting the Shah into the states, it precipitated all the problems, much of the problems with Iran. Now, Iran was the source of the second great crisis point for Carter's administration, and that was the taking by Iranian revolutionaries of 52 American hostages when they stormed the American embassy. I want to look at some of the background that I want to share with you on that. Bear with me as I'm, again, toggling between screens as I'm recording. So here's the background of what's going on to the hostage crisis. And again, we'll look at a couple of clips of the president speaking at that time. So it began in November '79. As I mentioned, the U.S. Embassy was stormed, and 52 Americans were taken hostage. They were held until January 20th, 1981. Iranians were so angry and so despised Carter that they made it clear that they would not release the hostages to him. There were all sorts of rumors at the time, and you could research it now, and none of it's been proven one way or the other, but there's many people think that the Reagan camp cut a deal with the Iranians during the election. But whether they cut a deal or not, the Iranians did not release the hostages until January 20th, which is the day Reagan took office, and they waited until after he took the oath of office to release the hostages. If you remember, 444 days, more than a year, and it was on everybody's mind. And Carter looked ineffective. He looked like he was not in control of the situation. And this perception came to a climax, as it was, in April of 1980, April 24th, actually. A rescue mission was put into place, and it failed. If you recall, 2 helicopters were sent. They collided in a sandstorm. You had 8 American servicemen were killed. It was a mess. Now, I mention this because these are the type of things that say, if only, right? If the rescue mission had succeeded, Carter would have been a hero. It didn't succeed. Was it bad planning? Did they not have enough equipment? I'm not sure. They had a sandstorm. Maybe it was events beyond his control. But it shows, I think, how the president can be at the mercy of things beyond its control. So in the same vein, President Trump is arguing that the pandemic is beyond his control. His administration, the past week or so, has been spinning stories that it's China's fault, that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan. Maybe it was intentionally released, maybe it was inadvertently released. The president and his supporters trying to say it's not his fault. Maybe. But the lack of planning and preparation on the part of the administration is his fault. So I think you can legitimately make the same claim about Carter. Were there warning signs? Should the embassy have been better protected? Was the rescue operation properly planned? Did they have enough equipment? I seem to recall, I didn't look into it before I started recording, I seem to recall that some of the early plans called for 3 helicopters, not 2. But whatever the case may be, I think Harry Truman had it right when he said the buck stops here. And so it's worth considering. I want to share with you, let's see which of these clips I want to play. I'm going to play. Let's see. I have two clips. One is on him speaking on the hostage crisis itself. One is his statement on the rescue mission. Let's listen to that one and see how he responded to this crisis, and the extent to which he took responsibility. So let me. I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully you'll be able to see this video. Okay, here we go. So for me, I thought it was a little refreshing, very refreshing, to hear a president and the commander in chief take responsibilities for decisions he made, even if they were events that were beyond his control. So the combination of the two, the oil crisis of '79, which had a tremendous negative impact on the U.S. economy, and the Iranian hostage crisis of '79 also, made it inevitable that Carter would lose the election in 1980, and made it inevitable that he would be a one-term president. So I wanted to share this with you for us to think about and ponder what the pandemic means for President Trump. Is this the type of crisis that will result in him being a one-term president? We'll find out in November. But I think the potential, at least for the similarity between the two, is worth discussing and noting. Now, having said all this, I want to take another look at Carter's legacy, in the sense that not everything was negative. And let me share with you a listing of some of his accomplishments that, oh darn. I'm going to pause this for a second because the page that I thought was loaded on my computer is not. Bear with me 1 second.